Good morning, folks. I'm Carolyn Spooner, and with my colleagues Mark Gilbert and Isabel Story, welcome to the State Library, and hello also to the people watching on the live stream. We would like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and pay our respects to elders past and present. We also advise that this slideshow has images of First Nations people who may have died. Our story begins some 65,000 years ago when the Kaurna people told their stories and kept their memories alive in their oral and artistic traditions. Fast forward to 1780, when George III threw a ball for his wife Queen Charlotte's birthday, and the tradition of young society women being presented at court began. Spoiler alert, Queen Elizabeth II ended this elite tradition in 1958. But the debutante ball has continued. Its main purpose in the olden days seemed to be to marry off your daughters, and it's safe to say that some girls enjoyed the experience and some didn't. The earliest reference to a debutante ball that I could find in South Australian newspapers on the fabulous national digitisation website Trove was at Government House in 1888. One evident debutante might have sat for a picture of Sweet 17, so pretty did she look in her dress of soft white silk, Indian muslin over white satin, caught together here and there with apparent carelessness with garlands of daisies. A fan, entirely composed of daisies, was carried in the hand and an aigrette of the same flower worn in the hair. An aigrette is a headdress, usually of feathers, but in this case flowers. So we have all the components of the debutante, the young girls, the white dresses, the flowers on the hand and the hair. We see that some of the dresses were designed by the interestingly named Parisian Scientific Dress Cutting Association in 44 Arcade. This is Adelaide Arcade, which opened 3 years earlier in 1885. Another dressmaker, Martin Brothers, not the same store as John Martin's, of Burlington House in Rundle Street, seen on the right of the photo, advertised in 1890 debutantes' dresses a speciality. A ladies' column by Viva gave a rather waspish view of the custom of coming out for rosebud girls. She wonders why it has to happen at a ball rather than a tennis party. She also observes that the most successful Debs are not necessarily the prettiest or the best dancers or the most brilliant talkers. The most successful Deb has charming manners which seem to hint that she adores and wonders at the surpassing cleverness and brilliancy of her partners. Ouch! The satirical newspaper Quiz feels great sympathy with the debutante, who needs to be aware of the glass of fashion in 1900. By then, white silk and satin are out of date. Snowdrops and daisies have had their day. Seems to be wandering a bit. Okay. Quiz advises Sweet 17 to wear very little jewellery during your first season, only say a string of pearls, which, like the poor, is always with us. Be very careful where you buy your shoes and gloves. You might have bought them in the newly opened Adelaide Arcade. A mayoral debutante ball at the Adelaide Town Hall in 1903 had full-page coverage. To the charming music of the gondoliers, the 20 Debs took their places with their partners for the Lancers. They're all named, some familiar surnames: Cohen, Searcy, Logue, Solomon. At the conclusion of this set, the program was entered upon in earnest. There were 20 dances, of which 11 were waltzes. The blasé debutante describes having one partner with an arm like a boat hook, who waltzed as if he had a starting gate continually in front of him. It was a most distressing exercise. A miserable debutante in a London paper objects to being hawked in the marriage market in the palpable way that we are. She does not think the best specimens of man frequent ballrooms. The best specimens have strenuous work to do in the daytime and cannot, will not, dare not jeopardise that work by inanely prancing around a room until daylight. Good on her. The Adelaide Club held a ball at Ayres House. Miss Sanderson, debutante, wore pretty white chiffon, taffeta and lace. And Miss Lucy Ayres was there too. Here's a fun fact. Lucy Ayres was the first volunteer at the State Library in 1920, continuing up to the 1960s. Debutante balls were also held in country towns, like the Masonic Hall in Port Pirie in 1907, where 4 debutantes took the opportunity and appeared in public for the first time. One of the 30 Debs at a university ball in 1912 was the writer, educator and women's rights campaigner Eleanor Walker, whose archival papers we hold. A popular venue was the Palais Royal on North Terrace, next to Ayres House, where in 1932, 11 charming Debs made their curtsy to the governor. Thanks, Steph. Their outfits were described in the Advertiser. Miss B. Black wore a graceful frock of parchment satin, fitting to the figure and flaring at the feet. Her short coatee was trimmed with mink fur around the elbow sleeves, and she carried a posy in autumn tints. An unusual name was Miss Adelaide Blades. I put her name into the catalogue, and sure enough, her name appears in that ball, which featured in South Australian Homes and Gardens in May 1932. In fact, she's sewn twice, and the photographer is the famous photographer D. Darian Smith, whose life's work the library recently acquired. The Palais isn't looking flash in this image in 1929. It was built in 1920 as the Palais de Danse. Then in 1967, it was converted to the Palais parking station and demolished in 1972. That's a very Adelaide story. But they obviously had a good time there. In 1961, the Red Cross Belle of Bells Ball was held at the Palais Royal, where 100 debutantes from around the state curtsied to the governor, Sir Edric Bastian, after whom the Bastian Wing was named, seen here visiting the library and chatting with Joyce Tucker, booksewer, and the Bastian Wing is now our Spence Wing. The June 1961 Australian's Women's Weekly featured 3 coming out occasions on its People and Parties page. Top left, at the Mercy Old Scholars Ball at the Palais Royal, were 35 Debs. Underneath is a coming out dance held at the Mount Osmond Country Club, and on the right is a coming out dance held at the family's townhouse, the Briars in Medindi. So coming out events can be held at home. Now let's look at some of the things we've got in our catalogue on debutantes. Evelina, or The History of a Young Lady's Entrance into the World by Fanny Burney, was first published in 1778. We have a few editions, including this 1903 edition, which is a special book because it's part of Sir Josiah Simon's library, which is now housed in the Mortlock Wing. Evelina writes, "I am half afraid of this ball tonight, for, you know, I have never danced but at school. However, Miss Mervyn says there is nothing in it, yet I wish it was over." Then she writes about the ball. "The gentlemen, as they passed and repassed, looked as if they thought we were quite at their disposal, and only waiting for the honour of their commands, and they sauntered about in a careless, indolent manner, as if with a view to keeping us in suspense." The Debutante, an entirely original semi-comic operetta in one act, was printed in Adelaide in 1882. Enter Jeanette. "Alack a day, I wonder how 'twill end. 2 men themselves would to myself commend." You know, the men don't seem to be coming out of this very well at all. Debutantes, a poem by James Devaney, is a limited edition in our special collection from 1939. Pageantry of colours, fair lights a-shine and frocking sweet. The pageant seems like some mystic sacrament, a bit sickly sentimental for our taste these days. In our theatre programme collection is a 1957 play, The Reluctant Debutante, by William Douglas Home. Now, the only actor's name I could recognise was John Melian, looking dashing as a younger man. Dance Little Ladies, The Days of the Debutante. This is a British book which gives the history of the subject and also a chapter on the reluctant Deb. One, now a journalist, wrote, "What I really wanted to do was to go to university, but my parents said it was too expensive. And in any case, there was no point because I would get married. They decided I should do the season instead." Debutante, Rights and Regalia of American Debdom, was published in 2004 and also treats the subject broadly. The chapter called A Different Kind of Debut looks at the African American community. While the fabled East Coast cotillions, a cotillion is a formal debutante ball, cloak themselves in philanthropic causes to dispel charges of extravagance and waste, however, the majority of the black ceremonies maintain their ties to education, acknowledging that the attainment of a degree was the surest stepping stone to economic security and social acceptance. Although most of our books are in print format, increasingly we also acquire books in electronic format as ebooks, which means you can read them at home. So if you click on the catalogue search and type in debutante in the quick search box, then click on ebook full text online, and you get 44 results. Let's look at the third one, High Society Advice. You can scroll down to the contents and click on the page you want to read. Public libraries, through their wonderful one-card system, have 163 books with the word debutante and 105 ebooks with titles like The Chocolate Debutante and The Dreadful Debutante. Now something completely different. The State Library has a wonderful poster collection, which is a mirror on the community, like this homemade poster for the Orroroo Area School Deb Ball of 1992. The library even has 6 things under film and sound. The first 3 are oral histories. Looking at the first one, the summary tells us it's an interview with Barbara Porter about growing up and living in Minlaton, and she talks about Minlaton's debutante balls. The second 3 items are film footage, and there's a video headed Aboriginal Australia, Volume 6, Commonwealth Department of Aboriginal Affairs from 1987, which features significant events which have occurred in Aboriginal communities throughout Australia, including Aboriginal debutante balls. At this stage, these videos haven't been digitised, so they can't be viewed, and we would need to get permissions to get this done. Now, I tried to find references on Trove to First Nations debutante balls in South Australia, but without luck. But there were plenty of references in interstate papers. Each Thursday night in a Fitzroy Hall, a group of debutantes rehearse their steps. Nothing unusual in that, but there is. This will be the first Aboriginal debutante set in Australia. With their partners, they will be presented to Sir George and Lady Knox at the Aboriginal Debutantes Ball at the Collingwood Town Hall on August the 26th. Originator of the idea was Mrs. G. Briggs, whose daughter is one of the Debs. The girls are all enthusiastic about it and thoroughly enjoy their rehearsals. They are a bright, jolly crowd of young people. The last format to look at is photographs, and here we hit the jackpot. When you do a subject search for debutante, only looking at pictorial material, you find 520 items. 447 of them are from Mount Gambier, where the Arthur Studio donated some 7,000 photographs to us without any copyright restrictions. So let's have a look at one of those images. Here is Miss Seeger as a debutante. Beautiful professional photograph with the markings on the negative. Now, there's a way that you can scroll through the thumbnails of all the debutante images. You might not have noticed when you view an image that above every image is a search for box, and you can type in anything you want to have a look at, like cricket or football or debutante. When you do that, you find the 572 images that you can scroll through 30 at a time, or look at them individually. The one second from right on the top looked interesting, and it is. It's a studio portrait of debutante Miss Geraldine J, and the catalogue record tells us it was included in an exhibition called A Century in Focus, South Australian Photography, 1840s to 1940s, in the Art Gallery of South Australia in 2007. Another significant Adelaide professional photographers collection that we have is the Vic Grimmett collection. Here's a debutante just named Janet in 1954. Looks like it's been taken at home. Vic took 7 images of her, and the best one would have gone into the newspaper. Another of Vic's images of Woodland's old scholar Sally Drew, who made her debut at Lordello House, East Terrace, on the 23rd of April 1954. A ball in Mount Gambier really introduced the Debs and their partners in high style. And there's some action happening here, so dancing, carrying the flowers, and curtsying to Lady McEwen at a ball in Port Wakefield. Town halls could hold large events. This one at Theberton in 1938, before it became Theby Theatre in 1979. The caption for this image is "Miniature Debutantes" at Glencoe near Mount Gambier. A Catholic debutante ball at Port Pirie around 1946 was a huge occasion. 75 people are named in the catalogue record, beginning with Glorine Pickering, and there is a key that shows which debutante is which. In closing, these days the debutante ball has probably morphed into the school formal, which can be hugely elaborate affairs. I wonder if they're as stressful as they could be in the olden days. Let's hope they're happy occasions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Mark Gilbert, a librarian here at the State Library, and I'm not going to talk about debutantes. I'm going to talk about football. Not so much the history of Australian rules in South Australia, but more a look at some of the fun ways football has infiltrated our lives through newspapers and magazines and other ways. The Pictorial Australian newspaper of May 1888 shows merry sketches of the comical scenes witnessed during a match between Norwood and Port Adelaide at Adelaide Oval. An exciting chase, head over heels, an enthusiastic yelling crowd with the lady's umbrella going up, and a lively moment. The game was a draw, even though Norwood kicked 2 more behinds than Port, because behinds were recorded, but they weren't counted at this time. But if you're a Norwood supporter, don't worry, because you did go on to win the premiership, although there weren't any grand final playoffs at this time. It's just who finished top of the ladder. As is currently the case, there has always been debates about rough play, and as you may know, the McGarry Medal was instituted in 1898 to encourage fair play. But in the 1920s, the question of rough play was debated again in the Saturday Journal, 25th of August 1923. They wrote about barbarous kicking in the ruck and raised the idea of wearing American-style football nose, head and shin pads. However, their artist, a gentleman by the name of F. Frost, had other ideas in this cartoon headed, "Present football is getting really rough, so it is suggested that more gentlemanly play be adopted. Will it come to this?" Oops, sorry, I'll go back. And if you just read the different captions there, I insist you must play with the wind. Thanks, old man, but I'd rather you did. Will you take this goal? Oh no, sir, it's your turn. Your mark, old chappie. The pleasure is yours, sir. The ball is at your service, old fellow. Needless to say, this sort of polite play did not eventuate. Alex Gurney was born in England but grew up in Hobart, and he is most famous for the comic strip Bluey and Curly, about two knockabout blokes during the Second World War and after. He worked on newspapers throughout Australia, including the News in Adelaide. He drew cartoons featuring Fred the News sporting character, which is not really the catchiest name for a comic strip character, Fred the News sporting character. In this one, Fred takes the reader through preparations for the 1933 season. The top left, players and barrackers are loosening up. The top right, the umpires are getting their annual supply of air down at the service station. And at the bottom right, it's sadness all round, as we see a poor pig lamenting his brother who's been turned into a football. And hence the saying, kicking the old pigskin. Later in the season, Fred heads off to Adelaide Oval for the Norwood Glenelg game. The fish in the Glenelg aquarium dance the Highland Fling every time the scores come through on the wireless. Young Clem Rosewarne kicks 7 and Blue Johnson, the McGarry medalist, 4 goals for the Seasiders. But the last panel has a contemporary relevance. What are you doing right up there? Just taking a look at the cost of living. Dora's diary was in the newspaper, written and drawn by Jack Quayle, who was a political cartoonist for the News, and he also created the comic strip Perce the Punter. Dora was very popular in the 1930s and into the 1940s, and also had a separate comic strip as well. Throughout the year, sports mad Dora would attend all sorts of sporting events, from tennis to lawn bowls and the trots at the Wayville Showgrounds. She travelled to all football grounds for the love of the game, and I'm assuming so the paper couldn't be accused of bias. Football really was the News's bread and butter during the season. This was a golden era for goal kickers, including Sturt's Beau Morton, Jack Owens from Glenelg, and the most famous of all, North's Ken Farmer. This 4th of June 1934 diary celebrates Farmer kicking 13 goals at Adelaide Oval against Norwood. Dora thinks Norwood should invest in stilts to stop Farmer kicking any more goals. But as we know, Farmer kept going, and here he is in 1938 kicking his 100th goal of the season at Norwood, much to the smiling North players' joy, and even the ball itself was happy. Believe it or not, oops, I'll skip through that one. Believe it or not, a writ was delivered to the News by West Torrens players when their players were drawn as brutes in their game against Sturt in 1934. Dora said she'd gone to the Oval on Saturday expecting to see a football match. Sturt came on the field under the impression that there was a game on too. And I do like that frame, top right, where the unsuspecting Sturt players are trotting onto the ground, not knowing what's going to hit them. Torrens were referred to as man-eaters and wild men to be put back in their cages. I did check, but the case didn't proceed. But it's just amazing, isn't it, to think of a writ being served for a comic strip. Dora and other cartoons I've shown can be found via the Trove website. That has digitised South Australian newspapers way back to 1836. Caricatures were also very popular around this time, and indeed into the 1950s. Carolyn did, when we did a rehearsal of this, she did mention to me that I should point out that I'm a staunch North Adelaide supporter. And who, it's just the way it goes. This one is of Ken Farmer, this caricature. and was sent to the champion full forward by a supporter celebrating his haul of 126 goals for the 1931 season, which was a premiership one for North. And it comes from farmers' scrapbooks that run to 9 very large volumes, like this big, masonite covers, they're very heavy, and that were kept first by his father and then by Ken himself. And they're now held by us here at the State Library. And we've digitised them so you can see them via the library catalogue. And there's some wonderful photographs and articles in it, including his coaching notes, because he was a successful premiership coach at North Adelaide. I won't mention North Adelaide again. Actually, I might. Wait. This is another caricature from the Farmer Scrapbook showing Farmer and Sturt's captain Laurie Curly King, probably before the 1931 grand final, and drawn by Lionel Coventry, who must have been the most industrious caricaturist in Australia at the time. He did thousands and thousands of caricatures of people from all walks of life, including politicians, business people, winemakers, and many, many more. I will point out that that scan comes directly from Farmer's Scrapbook, and if you do keep a scrapbook, don't use sticky tape. This is another Coventry caricature, and it does show players for the 1952 North and Norwood Grand Final, North's Jeff Fuller and Hubert McKenzie, and the Redlegs Bob Edwards and their ruckman Norm Walker. And here's a great one that shows one of South Australia's sport's great all-rounders, Vic Richardson, a Sturt and state footballer, test cricketer, and also lacrosse, tennis and hockey player, lawn bowler, snooker player, and radio announcer. And I believe he wrote for the newspaper too. When I was researching this talk, I came across this comic strip that is just of its time, but a lot of fun. Bush League boys, stout fellows all. So this comic strip ran in the Sunday Mail for the duration of the 1956 season, sponsored by SA Brewing. The artist was Doug Maxted, who became art director for the book publisher Rigby's before he moved to England, where amongst other credits he worked on the famous comic about the fictional soccer star Roy of the Rovers. In Bush League boys, the Weewacker football team trained on Southwick Stout, often supplied by coach Mike McGinty. When the stout was flowing, they were unbeatable. So the ne'er-do-wells of Drongo Flat try everything including bribery, as seen in these last 3 panels, where Lurk merchant Sid Shiner gets in the ear of Weewacker's centre half-back Blue Bulstrode. There was also kidnapping of star players, Captain Snowy Hoyle and ruckman Biff Bottomley. And tragically, they even cut the elastic in the shorts of Weewacker's full-back. The dastardly doers from Drongo Flat even stole a truckload of stout in the hope of nobbling Weewacker's chances of winning the premiership. And while there might have been some close games, inevitably the stout drinking Weewackers would overcome any obstacle. In the grand final, Weewacker have a day out. Blue must have been moved from centre half back as he kicks 20 goals, and Snowy Hoyle is planning to get married. Drongo Flats' Sid Shiner is languishing in jail and owing the jailer a bottle of stout, Southwick Stout. And the red and green flag of Weewacker will be flying over the Southwick Brewery. And I thought, well, they must have done that, but I couldn't find anything in the newspapers where I could prove that the flag did fly over the Southwick Brewery. Of course, you know that the Southwick Brewery was the West End Brewery at Thebarton, the suburb of Southwick being subsumed into Thebarton. And the West End Brewery was still in Hindley Street at this time, where it showed the premiership chimney, and that was there until the early 1980s. Now, unfortunately, Trove cuts off for the Sunday Mail in 1954, but you can still catch up on the adventures of the Weewackers on microfilm in our research library. So I'll warn the staff up there that there'll be a big mad rush for the 1956 Sunday Mail football season papers. As you wend your way through, the danger of going through the newspapers is just you get distracted. So I was looking for the Wee Wacker footy side, but no, I came across this as well. Some things catch your eye, including this eye-popping ad published in the Sunday Mail after the 1956 preliminary final, where Westies beat North. Smith's Whisky is sure it will be a Swisky grand final the following week. The grand final between Port and West was a great game by all reports, with Port getting up by 16 points. As you might know, there were a number of close grand finals between the two teams in the 1950s, with the Magpies having the best of the Blood and Tars by narrow margins in all four of them. Who would be a Westies supporter? There must be someone. And now let's have a look at the halcyon days of that holy book, The Football Budget. Auntie's Barrackers Club, unknown author but definitely has an ABC connection due to the name of the column and ABC presenters including Jim Dean, Mick Klingley and Malcolm McDonald being commonly mentioned. In this first round article from 1971, Auntie says she has sharpened her umbrella for the first match at Alberton and stocked up on crumpets and claret for the footy replays on television in the evening. I don't know if it's a myth, but there were certainly stories of, I suppose, elderly ladies prodding players with their umbrellas back in the day as they came off the ground. In her predictions for the season, Auntie only got one of the final four correct, Sturt. In fact, Central District played and won its first ever final, the first semi-final against Sturt. After trailing by 5 points at three-quarter time, they won by 27 points. Russell Ebert, not Woodville's Ray Huppets, won the Magarey medal, but she did correctly pick Glenelg's Fred Phillips as the top goal kicker with 99 goals. In the following week's budget, Auntie decides that she will take up umpiring, and she says, "I'm sure that we fair-minded, logical lady umpires would eliminate a lot of that rough play, bad language and uncouth behaviour that spoils our game. Why, if Peter Darley was rude to me, I'd just cry." The footy budget liked to have a bit of fun, such as this photo from 1970. That's it. Now just hold it like that till I fetch the photographer. And the Name the Player competition from 1977. Can you pick who it is? I will admit I went and cheated and looked at the following week's budget. It's actually Randall Gerlach of Port Adelaide. And it's also amazing how many footballers worked in sports stores at this time, such as Port's Carl Fragamini down at the bottom right there. And there was a comic sponsored by Amscol Footy Colours Ice Cream. Now you would think that the red and white would be the tastiest, but a friend tells me he remembers the double blue being pretty good. Cream Puff from the early 1970s was written by comedy writer Trevor Ferrant, who was also a writer for Norman Gunston. Cream Puff might not have been the smartest of footballers, but he knew how to take the coach's instruction. The coach describes Cream Puff. It's terrifying. It's quite terrifying. Hasn't got a brain of his own, so anything you tell him to do, he does without question. He gives the instruction, "Right, Creamy, we're depending on you. I want you to pick up this bloke from the first bounce and stick to him all day." Of course, Cream Puff follows the instruction. After the game, one of Cream Puff's teammates says, "Beauty coach, we made the grand final." The coach replies, "Creamy's a bloke to thank, where is he anyway?" When the coach goes to the opposition change room, Cream Puff is still sticking. This one is based on the old chewy on your boot distraction when the full forward's kicking for goal. But he's quite happy because it turns out there was chewy on his boot, which meant that Cream Puff was warning him about it. And you might recognise the TV presenter Eldon Crouch, or, as the June 9th edition calls him, Elvis Couch, as Cream Puff appears on the Total Talkball show with other well-known commentators, Wally Mayhem and Ken Cunningham. The cartoonist has a lot of fun with KG's pronunciation of the English language. All poor old Cream Puff wanted to do was meet Humphrey Bear. Perhaps Cream Puff did occasionally show a bit of cunning, as on this occasion when he faced the tribunal. Player Cream Puff, you are charged with unduly rough play against player Smith. Well, my lad, it was like this. First he said the tribunal were a bunch of dills. That's when I jobbed him. Then he said the tribunal was all mug lares, so I jumped him. And when he said the tribunal was all deadhead drongos, that's when I hit him with a picket. So the tribunal deliberates and decides, Cream Puff not guilty, Smith 10 matches. I don't know if that ever worked to get a player off. Of course, we don't just have newspapers and magazines in the library. This lovely postcard from our Children's Literature Research Collection was sent to Miss Ethel Lucy of Modbury from her uncle Len that shows his support of the Sturt Football Club, dated September 2nd, 1906. And during this season, the Sturt team included the 1903 Magarey medalist, ruckman Taffy Way, who would drive a horse and buggy from Wollonga every Saturday to ovals all over Adelaide. Now, I did say I wasn't going to mention North Adelaide again, but also from our Children's Literature Research Collection, this lovely celluloid doll, probably from the early 1930s, going by the Guernsey there, carries the card with the verse, "This little man in red and white comes as a mascot true. He plays the game with all his might and hopes the Norths will win the fight and victors prove for you." How sweet is that? Belonged to a Miss Amy Grant. This badge shows the 1928 King of Football, which was Glenelg's Jim Hanby, who won the Magarey Medal that year. After his football career, he became a publican and also in 1949 was elected to federal parliament. And if there is a king, there should be a queen. This badge featuring Miss Marge White, she was South Adelaide Football Club's Queen of Football. In 1939, a competition was held to raise funds for the Children's Hospital, with voting on the club queens held throughout the season. At the SANFL's Grand Charity Ball in September at the Palais Royal, Miss Patricia Knoll of Sturt was crowned. Marge is on the right of the photo. I did count and I'm unsure what happened to Miss West Torrens, who was missing from the photo. Club badges, transfers and stickers are not only to show your support, but were made to promote businesses, including this 1921 Port Adelaide badge, produced by Fuller and Teague Tailors. Pardon me. Fuller and Teague were at 70 Commercial Road in the port. This shell transfer for your car, a Cock of the North from the early 1950s. Beautiful, isn't it? Not quite so beautiful are these Bays and Sturt mobile transfers from about 1965, but they are lovely. Just look how great they are, the character in those drawings. This Norwood Redlegs badge is from 1963 and was part of a promotion for Milo. And these late 60s, early 70s plastic badges were found in Twisties packets. And while Woodville weren't the most successful club in the SANFL's history, they did have some very attractive merchandise. Again, another 1965 mobile transfer, and this sticker from 1971. And we're back to AMSCOL again for these footy colour stickers from 1973, South Adelaide and West Torrens. We have thousands of football-related photographs in our collection, which you can see via our catalogue. SANFL, state teams, country, amateur leagues, AFL, photos going back to the 1880s and the 1890s. And as I say, they can be found via our catalogue. This is a great photo, partly because the North player is kicking it and the Port player is spoiling the kick with his face in a mini-league game from April 1990. It did remind me of something, and I couldn't quite remember what when I first saw it, and then it dawned on me, back to where we started, the Pictorial Australian of May 1888, captioned, "One for his knob." Some things never change in the rough house of Australian rules football. Thank you for listening to me. I'm going to pass on now to Isabel's story.
So I have the opportunity to talk to you today about Doodles. Before I started this, I knew nothing about Doodles. Now I know a little bit more than nothing. This is the Adelaide Fringe poster for 1988. Oh, of course. Thank you, Steph. Okay, so this is the Adelaide Fringe poster, festival poster for 1988. And it was done by an artist called Bronwyn Platten, who at that time lived at St Peter's. When she was interviewed about her prize-winning entry into the Fringe poster competition, Bronwyn said, "It was created from a doodle." So what is that, and where did the name come from? This is what most people think of when they think doodles. So we're looking at a page created by Louisa von Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who happened to be the Queen of Prussia and the wife of King Frederick William III. This page was created in the late 18th century. They're mainly profile depictions of dresses and bonnets, hairstyles and flowers. She was probably about 12 at that time, and they would have been called drawings or scribbles back then. That's because the word doodle wasn't yet applicable. The word most likely derives from the German word Dudeltopf, as in dull or dull-headed or nightcap. By the 18th century, doodle in English meant a simpleton, as in Yankee Doodle Dandy, which was originally a derogatory ditty sung by the British troops. It was turned around by the Americans, who took it as a patriotic song. Later, the word referred to a doodle or a doodle-headed politician who did nothing for his electorate. Sounds familiar. And from there, doodling came to mean to do nothing or wasting time. Today, the word doodle is defined by the Macquarie Dictionary as to scribble or draw aimlessly. So to the majority of people, especially school teachers and lecturers, doodling, like its cousin daydreaming, is just a time-wasting, aimless activity. But is it? To find out, I experimented with various combinations of doodle, doodling and value use in the State Library's Quick Search catalogue. Now, the Quick Search is distinct from a classic catalogue search in that it provides a very broad sweep of the library's various collections and databases. Sometimes it's a bit too broad and not all the information will be relevant. However, Quick Search is really useful for finding recent information such as journal and magazine articles and published papers. Shown on the screen here is a fraction of the articles about the use and value of doodling. And I discovered that far from it being an aimless pursuit, doodling is very useful in learning, business and health and other areas. Doodling can enhance focus in children and in adults. It's helped marine biologists to remember the names of a wide range of species. It's helped student nurses to understand and relate complex procedures, and foreign language learners to recall idioms. It can even be used to predict and identify potential burnout and stress. Now, sometimes adding lines to the printed page can be something else entirely. So when is a doodle not a doodle? On the left, you can see a book, Marginalia, Readers Writing in Books by H.J. Jackson, and on the right, Used Books, Marking Readers in Renaissance England by William H. Sherman. Look at the pointing finger on the cover of Used Books there on the right. Anyone know what it's called? Okay, it took me a while to find out. It's called a manicule, and it appears drawn in many forms in old manuscripts and printed books between the 12th and 18th centuries. Its function is to indicate important passages. So here it is again on the left. On the right is a 16th century work which was owned by a high-ranking member of the clergy, and you can see that a number of comments have been added. These are called marginalia or annotations. There's also scribbling on the right side margin. What's happened there? I flipped back, sorry. There's also scribbling in the right side margin. And it turns out that scribbling and doodling in the margins of books, actions librarians view with a very jaundiced eye, are time-honoured traditions. And in the correct hands, quills or pencils, hopefully not biros, can add to the intellectual and monetary value of a book or a manuscript. But please do not practice manicules, marginalia or annotation in our library books. Use your own. So these are two examples of doodles and scribbles created by children. At least the children were blamed. On the left is a reproduction of the royal arms in a 1628 King James Bible. The embellishment is assumed to have been done by a child, and you can see it best if you start at the bottom. This is the image on the left, under the words Dieu est mon droit, and follow the line of circles all the way round. Now, this Bible was both a sacred and a valuable item, so hopefully the perpetrator had very lenient guardians. On the right, you can see a scribbled portrait in a child's reader. That's up the top right. And the reader is from Ontario, Canada. The date is approximately 1913. It seems that humans have always added to books and papers and on walls. We call the latter graffiti, of course. And some have made very good use of doodling and turned it into art. Think of the graffiti artist Banksy, for example. I'm going to show you now an example of someone who definitely wasn't practicing art. This is from our children's literature research collection. It shows the cover of a primary school series of primers, the Wide Range Reader. This is Blue Reader number 5, and here's how one pupil chose to enhance the cover. There you go. This one is an annotated copy of the 1841 South Australian Almanac. There is some disagreement over whether this is a doodle or an illustration. It was certainly added afterwards to a printed work. The creator was a well-known South Australian colonial artist, John Michael Skipper. Now, the illustration personalises the almanac, but who knows? It could have started off as a random doodle or been created to cover an ink blot or a cup of spilt tea. This item is part of the State Library's collection of calendars. It's an 1881 diary produced by Hudson and Kearns and issued through local stationers E.S. Wiggin Son. It contains 48 pages. It measures 28 by 22.5 centimetres. It has a cloth cover and a leather binding with what looks to be a leather string closure, and it comes complete with a blotting pad, and it would not have been a cheap item back in 1881. A name can be seen bottom right, and maybe the signature of the diary's artist, but it's difficult to decipher. There are 3 blackbirds seen, and it's very interesting to speculate about them. I first thought they were created by a male, perhaps someone who worked long hours in an office and was just longing to be somewhere else, but there are other possibilities. The early 1880s was a time when increasing numbers of women and men were starting to talk about improving rights for women. This caged bird seems a very apt symbol for an era when women were bound by societal expectations, minimal access to higher education and careers, and with virtually no political voice. Single women were expected to marry, but given the restrictions on married women and ownership of property, not everyone wanted to. So it's just possible that the creator of these little drawings was a young man or woman daydreaming of freedom, or maybe the artist just liked drawing birds. We'll never know for sure. Hopefully that image gives us a little bit of a clue. So let's now see what a late 20th century graphologist thought about doodles. Graphology is the study of handwriting to reveal personality. Some regard it as a pseudoscience, and it is not the same as forensic document analysis used by legal authorities. These are the front and back covers of a book produced in 1987 by Patricia Mann, Reveal the Secrets in Doodles, Learn to Analyse Your Doodles. The State Library holds South Australia's only library copy of this work, but it can be purchased online. Mann's books on graphology, especially in relation to sex and crime, were very popular in the 80s and 90s. So self-help and pseudo-psychology were all the rage back then. Mann regarded doodle scrawls and sketches as symbolic language, which, if read correctly, revealed hidden thoughts and personality traits. So let's start with the basics. Feminine and masculine doodles. The 20th century gender divide seems to have been viewed much more simply in the 80s than it is today, certainly by this author. These are wish fulfilment doodles, and they look remarkably similar to the feminine doodles we've just seen. And here's a set of travel doodles, and these bear a marked resemblance to the masculine doodles, even down to the aeroplane in the centre. And these are sexual doodles. References to sexuality are scattered throughout the book. The ghost-like doodles on the right are, and I quote, sexually inspired, showing that the doodler is preoccupied with his fantasies and is expressing them graphically. The remaining images are all attributed to females. And Mann writes that they reveal, even these innocent teacups, Mann writes that they reveal their creators' unconscious minds are wandering off into sexual fantasy. Even that innocent-looking coffee cup. So moving right along, if you're a social person, you'll be drawing something like this. And then hearts and arrows, well-known romantic symbol, but flowers and butterflies can also symbolise a romantic streak. Doodling flowers can also signify fertility and a longing for children. And if you're the aggressive type, your random scribbles may look more like that. This one shows very mild aggression. But as Mann observes, they aren't particularly heavy or menacing, and because the doodler, Tom, has used light pressure to draw the lines and daggers, it shows he's sensitive and has quite a nice nature without too much aggression, end quote. This one is an example of methodical planner's doodling, showing imagination and an eye for detail. But because he focuses his mind so much, the author notes that there may be a tendency to neglect his own emotional needs. And this one is a big personality. The reader is informed there's lots of ambition here, but also a sense of humour. The creator of this exaggerated word is confident and very conscientious. He welcomes change and variety. And I quote, "This is a typical male doodle, expressing a somewhat erratic and yet disciplined creativity." So let's say goodbye now to Patricia Mann with this pleasant, peaceful female doodle. There you go. And returning to the present, this is Joe Whale on the left, also known as the Doodle Boy. Any of you heard of him? A couple of you. Yep, okay, a couple of nodding heads there. All right, so around 5 years ago, as a 9-year-old English schoolboy, Joe wasn't paying much attention in class. All he wanted to do was doodle. There's a song in there somewhere. He was repeatedly told off by his teachers, but his parents saw it quite differently, and they sent him off to after-school art classes. When his art teacher posted his images on Instagram, a restaurant owner in Shrewsbury commissioned Joe to decorate his dining room. The young artist was soon celebrated in articles and online, and at 13, he is a professional book illustrator as well as an interior decorator. We don't know how his schoolwork is progressing. You can see, a couple of his books here. And some of them are available through the public library system. This is Libraries SA, which will show you public library holdings. Carolyn's already shown them to you. And these are available anywhere in South Australia and their current availability. And the nice thing about it is it gives you all kinds of information. So just go onto Libraries SA and a couple of clicks and you're there. A number of renowned writers and artists and politicians and actors were also doodlers. A lot of celebrities doodled. Alexander Pushkin was a Russian poet and novelist, short story writer and a playwright. He was well known for doodling, especially in his own manuscripts. Google Doodles chose to commemorate Pushkin using one of his own works, this self-portrait, and there's the Google Doodle. If you're interested, you can go to the Google archive. They've got a lot of interesting stuff. These are several more examples of celebrity doodles. This one on the left, drawn in the late 1950s by American President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It just happens to appear on the agenda of a congressional leaders' meeting. This cheery one on the right is by fashion and fine art photographer Richard Avedon. And these are Queen Victoria's drawings of her mother in her carriage and a lady on horseback, side saddle of course. And those images, those last four images, are from a book of collected celebrity doodles and drawings put together by the Schulzen family. It's called Scrawl, an A to Z of famous doodles. Here are a couple more images from it. Oops, sorry, I'll go back. Sorry, I've already shown you those images. Just to tell you that Scrawl is on order for the State Library and will soon be on our shelves. And finally, it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about doodles without remembering a famous children's artist who arrived here in 1959 as an alien, but now calls Australia home. This beloved Australian icon had a 34-year television career, and the Royal Mint even produced a series of coins to celebrate what would have been his 60th anniversary. I'm referring, of course, to the beloved star of ABC children's television, Mr. Squiggle, who commuted from the moon in his faithful rocket before settling here permanently. And there are his friends, Bill the Steam Shovel, Gus the Snail, his grumpy old blackboard, and Mr. Squiggle himself. Mr. Squiggle's doodled artworks can still be viewed on YouTube and in the National Film and Sound Archive, from whence came several of the following images. Here he is with his friends. There's Norm Hetherington on the left, cartoonist and puppeteer, who was Mr. Squiggle's creator and voice. You can also see Bill the Steam Shovel and Miss Pat, that's Pat Lovell, who was the first of Mr. Squiggle's on-screen human friends. Margaret Hetherington, wife of Norm, wrote the scripts, and their daughter Rebecca worked on the show from 1990. And here's Mr. Squiggle in action with a doodle sent in by a young ABC viewer. Whoops. And what he does with it is turn it into a friendly dog, but that image seems to have disappeared. I'm going to end today with this rather poignant card drawn by Norm Hetherington from Pat Lovell's collection. And here he is, Mr. Squiggle, hitchhiking to Adelaide, looking quite sad and sighing, "Oh, well. Mr. Squiggle, we would have loved to have had you here in Adelaide. And if Adelaide had known you were coming, we would have sent a gold-plated rocket to pick you up." So that's it for today, folks. Thank you very much for your attendance. We've had a lovely time. I hope you have too.